The blood on Grace Turner's lip dried in the cold morning air as she stumbled away from the only home she had ever known. The year was 1876, and Central City, Colorado had been booming since gold was discovered there nearly 20 years prior. But for Grace, there was nothing golden about this place anymore, only the bitter taste of rejection and the sting of her husband's final blow. "Barren women have no place in this family," Robert had spat at her as he threw her few belongings into the dirt. 5 years of marriage had yielded no children, and his patience had worn as thin as the mountain air. His mother stood on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, face pinched with disgust. "You've brought shame to this family," the older woman had said. "A real woman gives her husband sons." Grace clutched the small bundle of clothes to her chest and walked away from the neat white house on the edge of town, her ribs aching where Robert had kicked her when she'd begged him to reconsider. She had endured his growing cruelty for years, the disappointment that turned to resentment, then to violence. Each monthly confirmation of her failure had been met with harsher treatment. Last night had been the worst, after the doctor had finally confirmed what they had long suspected. Grace would never bear children. She had no family to turn to. Her parents had died of fever 3 years earlier, leaving her with only Robert, who had once promised to cherish and protect her. Those promises had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh Colorado sun. The main street was already bustling with miners heading to their claims, merchants opening shops and women sweeping doorways. Grace kept her head down, avoiding their stares. Everyone would know by nightfall if they didn't already. In a town this size, gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire. "Mrs. Turner?" a voice called, and Grace flinched, turning to see Mrs. Peterson, the kind-faced wife of the general store owner. "Dear heaven, what's happened to your face?" Grace touched her swollen cheek self-consciously. "It's nothing, Mrs. Peterson." "Nothing doesn't leave marks like that," the older woman said, her eyes narrowing. "Robert again?" Grace nodded slightly, too exhausted to deny it. "And where are you going with that bundle at this hour?" I don't know," Grace admitted, her voice breaking. "Robert has cast me out. I cannot bear children." Mrs. Peterson's face softened with sympathy, but there was also a wariness there. A barren woman was considered unlucky by many, a burden with no purpose. "I'm sorry, dear. If I had room—" She trailed off, the apology in her eyes not extending to an offer of shelter. "I understand," Grace said, though she didn't. How could someone who had known her for years suddenly see her as less than human because her womb wouldn't quicken? "Try Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house," Mrs. Peterson suggested, already stepping away. "Perhaps she needs help with the cleaning." Grace nodded and continued down the street, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled out despite the early hour, past the barbershop where men gathered to discuss mining claims and politics, past the church where she'd prayed countless nights for God to bless her with a child. At the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway took one look at her bruised face and bundle of possessions and shook her head. "I run a respectable establishment," she said firmly. "I can't have a woman whose husband has thrown her out. People would talk." "I can work," Grace pleaded. "I can clean, cook, anything." "I'm sorry," the woman said, though her tone suggested she wasn't. "I have my reputation to consider." By midday, Grace had been turned away from every respectable establishment in Central City. The only offers she'd received were from the owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon, who suggested she could entertain his customers, and a leering miner who said she could share his bed if she'd cook his meals. Both options made her stomach turn. With nowhere else to go, she found herself at the edge of town, sitting on a fallen log near the creek. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager dinner. She had exactly $2.17 to her name, everything she'd managed to save from the egg and butter money Robert had occasionally let her keep. She stared at the rushing water, wondering if it would be kinder to walk into its depths and let the current take her. What kind of life awaited a woman cast out, with no family, no children, and no purpose? "Miss, are you all right?" The voice startled her from her dark thoughts. She looked up to see a tall man on horseback, watching her with concern. He wore the practical clothing of a rancher or cowboy, worn leather chaps over denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a dusty brown hat that shadowed his features. His horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, nickered softly. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though her bruised face and red-rimmed eyes clearly told another story. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback and approached slowly, as if she were a skittish colt. As he came closer, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with kind brown eyes and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. "You don't look fine," he said gently. "In fact, you look like you could use a friend." Grace looked away, embarrassed by her disheveled appearance and the obvious signs of her husband's cruelty. "I don't need charity, sir." "I wasn't offering charity," he said, taking a seat on the log a respectful distance from her. "Just conversation if you want it. My name's Luke Yates. I have a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town." "Grace Turner," she replied automatically, then winced. Soon she would have to stop using Robert's name. But she wasn't ready to go back to being Grace Thompson, the naive girl who had believed in love. "That's a pretty name," Luke said, then frowned as he got a better look at her face. "Who did that to you, Mrs. Turner?" "It doesn't matter," Grace said, rising stiffly, her body protesting after sitting so long. "I should go." "Go where?" he asked simply. The question stopped her. Where indeed? She had nowhere to go, no one who would take her in. She sank back onto the log, suddenly overwhelmed by the hopelessness of her situation. "I don't know," she whispered. Luke watched her for a long moment, his expression troubled. "I don't mean to pry, but it looks like you've fallen on hard times. Are you hungry?" As if in answer, her stomach growled loudly, and a flush crept up her neck. Luke pretended not to notice as he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I was heading into town for supplies, but I packed some food for the ride. There's enough to share." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a generous portion of bread, cheese, and dried beef. Grace hesitated, her pride warring with her hunger. Luke divided the food and held out her share. "Please," he said, "I can't eat it all anyway." Finally, her hunger won. She accepted the food with murmured thanks and ate slowly, savoring each bite. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the bubbling creek and distant hammering from the mines. "Do you want to talk about it?" Luke asked finally. Grace stared at the water. Perhaps it was the kindness in his voice or simply the desperate need to unburden herself, but she found herself telling this stranger everything: her marriage to Robert, the years of hoping for a child, the gradual souring of his affection, the doctor's final verdict, and her husband's brutal response. "He said I was worthless," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "That a woman who can't have children has no value." Luke's face had darkened during her story, his hands clenching into fists at the description of Robert's violence. "Your husband," he said with careful control, "is a fool and a coward. No man worthy of the name beats a woman, especially his wife." "It doesn't matter now," Grace said. "He's cast me out, and no one in town will help me. A barren woman is a burden." "Is that what they said?" Luke asked, his voice sharp with indignation. "Not in those exact words, but yes. A woman's purpose is to bear children. Without that," she trailed off, the unspoken conclusion hanging in the air. "That's horseshit," Luke said bluntly, then immediately apologized. "Pardon my language, Mrs. Turner, but that's the only word for such nonsense. You're worth more than bearing babies." Grace looked at him in surprise, unused to hearing such a sentiment. In her world, a woman's value was measured by her ability to produce children, preferably sons. It was simply the way things were. "What will you do now?" Luke asked. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I have a little money, but not enough to get me very far. I thought perhaps I could find work as a housekeeper or cook, but everyone in this town is too concerned with gossip to help a woman in need," Luke finished for her, disgust evident in his tone. Something like that. Luke was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Mrs. Turner, I have a proposition for you, and I want you to understand that it comes with no expectations beyond what I'm about to offer." He paused, considering his words carefully. "I need help at my ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, left last month to care for her daughter who's having a baby. I've been managing on my own, but poorly. The house is a mess, and I'm a terrible cook." Grace eyed him warily. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A job," Luke said simply. "Room, board, and fair wages in exchange for cooking and keeping house. I have a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house that Mrs. Wilkins used. It would be yours for as long as you need it." "And you expect nothing else?" Grace asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. She'd had enough offers that day to know what men usually wanted. Luke's face reddened slightly, but he met her gaze directly. "I expect you to cook, clean, and take care of the house. Nothing more. You'd have your own space, and I give you my word as a gentleman that I would never impose on you in any way." He paused, then added, "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I swear to you that you'll be safe at my ranch." Grace studied him, trying to read his intentions. There was nothing but sincerity in his brown eyes, and something in her, some instinct she'd learned to trust, told her he was being truthful. "I don't know the first thing about ranching," she admitted. Luke smiled, and the warmth of it transformed his face. "I'm not asking you to wrangle cattle, just to make the house livable again and cook something better than the burned beans I've been surviving on." Grace couldn't help but smile back, her first genuine smile in longer than she could remember. "I can certainly manage that." "Then it's settled," Luke said, standing and offering her his hand. "If you're willing, we can go now. I just need to pick up a few supplies in town first." Grace hesitated, looking toward Central City. The thought of walking back through town, facing the stares and whispers, made her stomach clench. "I'd rather not go back through town," she admitted. Luke nodded in understanding. "Then I'll make a quick trip for supplies while you wait here." "I won't be long." True to his word, Luke returned within the hour, his saddlebags bulging with provisions. He helped Grace mount his horse, then led them away from Central City, away from the life she was leaving behind. As they traveled, Luke pointed out landmarks and told her about his ranch, the 100 acres he'd purchased 5 years ago, the small herd of cattle he was slowly building, the vegetable garden that had gone to weeds since Mrs. Wilkins left. He spoke with pride of his achievements and candor about his struggles, and Grace found herself drawn to his open, honest manner. When they crested a hill in late afternoon, Luke stopped and gestured to the valley below. "There it is, the Flying Y Ranch." Grace took in the sight of the modest homestead nestled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. The main house was a substantial log cabin with a covered porch, smoke curling from the stone chimney. A large barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, and beyond it, she could see cattle grazing in a meadow. It wasn't grand, but it was neat and well-maintained, the work of a man who took pride in what he'd built. "It's lovely," she said honestly. Luke smiled, pleased by her approval. "It's not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine. I built most of it with my own hands." They rode the rest of the way down to the ranch, and Luke helped her dismount when they reached the yard. A border collie came bounding out to greet them, circling Luke's legs excitedly before turning curious eyes to Grace. "That's Patch," Luke said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "He's a good cattle dog and better company." He led her first to the small cabin that would be her home. It was a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a few basic furnishings. It was clean, if a bit dusty from disuse. "Mrs. Wilkins left some things behind," Luke explained, showing her a trunk at the foot of the bed. "Said she was too old to be carting them around. There might be something useful." Grace ran her hand over the simple quilt on the bed, fighting back tears at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she managed. "This is more than generous." "It's a fair exchange," Luke said, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Come on, I'll show you the main house and you can see what you're getting yourself into." The main house was indeed a mess. though not from neglect so much as the bachelor habits of its owner. Dishes were stacked haphazardly, clothes were draped over chairs, and everything needed a good dusting, but the structure itself was solid and well built. "I told you it was bad," Luke said sheepishly. "I've seen worse," Grace assured him, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "I'll have it right in no time." "I'll leave you to get settled," Luke said. "There's a pump in the yard for water, and I've stocked your cabin with firewood. I usually eat around sunset, but there's no rush tonight if you're tired." "I'll have something ready," Grace promised. "After all you've done, it's the least I can do." Luke looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded instead. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." Left alone, Grace explored the kitchen, finding it surprisingly well-equipped despite the disorder. She found enough ingredients to make a simple stew and cornbread, and by the time Luke returned from his chores, she had a hot meal waiting. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the transformed kitchen. Grace had cleaned as she cooked, and now the room was tidy, with the table set and the delicious smell of beef stew filling the air. "I can't remember the last time I came home to something like this," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "It's nothing fancy," Grace said, suddenly shy under his admiring gaze. "It's perfect," he insisted, washing up at the basin she'd prepared. They ate together at the table, Luke telling her more about the ranch and his plans for expanding the herd. He was a good conversationalist, asking about her interests and listening attentively to her answers. Grace found herself relaxing in his company, the tension of the day gradually easing from her shoulders. After dinner, Luke insisted on helping with the dishes despite her protests. "My mother raised me better than to let a woman do all the work," he said firmly, rolling up his sleeves. Working together, they quickly finished the task, and Luke bid her good night, reminding her that she should rest and not worry about rising early. "The ranch will still be here tomorrow," he said with a smile. In the privacy of her cabin, Grace finally allowed the events of the day to catch up with her. She opened the trunk Luke had mentioned and found several practical dresses that, with minor alterations, would fit her well enough. Mrs. Chin Wilkins had also left behind some personal items: a hairbrush, a small mirror, a worn Bible, and a crocheted shawl. Grace changed into a nightgown from her own meager belongings and climbed into the narrow bed, expecting to lie awake with worry. Instead, exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, and she fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in years, free from the fear of being awakened by Robert's angry fists. The following weeks established a comfortable routine. Grace rose early to prepare breakfast for Luke before he went out to tend the cattle. She spent her days cleaning the main house until it shone, cooking meals, tending the vegetable garden she'd reclaimed from the weeds, and doing laundry. In the evenings, she and Luke would eat together, talking about their days and gradually sharing more of their personal histories. She learned that Luke had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, seeking a fresh start away from the memories of battle. He had worked as a cowhand on several ranches before saving enough to buy his own land. He'd been engaged once to a girl back east, but she'd married another while he was fighting for the Union. "Probably for the best," he said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the old hurt. "I wasn't the same man who left, and she wanted the life I couldn't give her anymore." In turn, Grace shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, her parents' decision to move west for better opportunities, and eventually her courtship with Robert, though she avoided speaking of the darker years of their marriage. "He was charming when we met," she explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "My parents liked him because he had prospects in the mining business. He seemed kind then." "People can change," Luke said, his expression thoughtful. "Or maybe they just show their true selves over time." "Perhaps," Grace agreed. "I sometimes wonder if I could have done something differently, if I could have been what he wanted." "Don't," Luke said, his voice suddenly fierce. "Don't blame yourself for his cruelty. No decent man treats his wife the way he treated you, children or no children." Grace was startled by his vehemence. "You truly believe that?" "I do," Luke said firmly. "My mother couldn't have children after me. My father never loved her any less for it. They'd hoped for a large family, but he always said that she was enough, that I was enough." He looked at her directly. "A woman is not just a vessel for children, "Grace, you have value far beyond your ability to bear a child." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his words, so different from everything she'd been taught. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "Well, it's getting late. I should turn in." As the days passed, Grace found herself healing, not just the visible bruises that Robert had left, but the deeper wounds to her spirit. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch when someone moved too quickly. She began to sing again as she worked, something Robert had forbidden because he found it irritating. She started to recognize herself in the reflection that looked back from the small mirror, not the frightened, diminished woman she'd become, but the person she'd been before, with hopes and dreams and opinions of her own. Luke noticed the changes in her. "You're blooming," he said one day as she arranged wildflowers she'd collected in a jar on the kitchen table. "Like those flowers you keep bringing in?" Grace blushed at the compliment. "I feel different here. Lighter." "Good," Luke said simply. "That's how it should be." One rainy afternoon, about a month after Grace's arrival, Luke returned from town with a surprise. "I was at the general store, and they had this," he said, handing her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you might like it." Grace unwrapped the gift to find a beautiful leather-bound journal and a pen with a fresh bottle of ink. "Luke," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "It's lovely, but you shouldn't have. You mentioned you used to keep a journal," he said, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "I thought maybe you'd like to start again." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. Robert had never given her presents except for practical items on Christmas that he expected her to use for his benefit: a new iron, cooking pans, mending materials. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I'll treasure it." That night she began writing again, pouring out her thoughts and feelings onto the blank pages. It was cathartic to put words to her experiences, to acknowledge how far she had come in such a short time. As spring turned to summer, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to Luke. He was unfailingly kind, not just to her, but to his animals and the occasional visitor to the ranch. He worked hard from dawn to dusk, his strong hands gentle with newborn calves and skilled with tools. He had a quiet humor that could make her laugh even on difficult days, and a way of listening that made her feel truly heard. She tried to dismiss these feelings as mere gratitude or the natural outcome of their close proximity, but in the privacy of her journal, she admitted the truth. She was falling in love with Luke Yates. The realization terrified her. She had been so wrong about Robert, how could she trust her judgment now? Besides, Luke had never indicated any romantic interest in her. He treated her with respect and kindness, but always maintained a proper distance. Luke, for his part, found himself increasingly captivated by the woman who had transformed not just his home, but his life. Her quiet strength amazed him, the way she had survived Robert's cruelty without becoming bitter. The gentle determination with which she approached every task, the slowly blossoming confidence as she realized her own worth. He'd hired her out of compassion and a sense of justice, never expecting to find himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening, anticipating her smile and the comfortable conversations that stretched later into the night as they grew more at ease with each other. But Luke was cautious. Grace was still healing from years of abuse, still finding her footing in this new life. The last thing she needed was another man imposing his desires on her. So he kept his growing feelings to himself, determined to be the friend and employer she needed, nothing more. Their careful dance around their feelings might have continued indefinitely if not for the events of a scorching July day. Luke had ridden out at dawn to check on the cattle in the far pasture, concerned about the lack of rain and the dwindling water supply in the smaller creek that fed that section of the ranch. Grace spent the morning canning vegetables from the garden, the kitchen sweltering as she worked over the hot stove. By mid-afternoon, with her task complete and the heat at its peak, she decided to cool off in the creek that ran behind the house. It was something she'd begun doing recently, finding a secluded pool where she could bathe in privacy. She gathered soap and a towel, leaving a note for Luke in case he returned while she was gone. The creek was a welcome relief from the heat, the water cool against her skin as she waded in wearing her chemise. She had just finished washing and was sitting on a rock letting the sun dry her hair when she heard the panicked whinny of a horse. Grace quickly pulled on her dress and followed the sound upstream. To her horror, she found Luke's horse, Rusty, rearing at the edge of a steep embankment, Luke nowhere in sight. "Rusty!" she called, approaching the agitated animal cautiously. The gelding calmed at her familiar voice, allowing her to catch his reins. That's when she saw Luke, lying motionless at the bottom of the ravine. "Luke!" she screamed, heart pounding with fear. She secured Rusty to a tree and scrambled down the slope, slipping and sliding in her haste to reach him. Luke was unconscious, a nasty gash on his forehead bleeding freely. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle beneath him. Grace checked for a pulse with trembling fingers, nearly collapsing with relief when she felt the strong, steady beat. "Luke, can you hear me?" she called, gently patting his cheek. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing pupils of uneven size. "Grace?" he murmured, confusion clouding his features. "What happened?" "I think you fell," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Can you move?" Luke attempted to sit up, then fell back with a groan of pain. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it's broken." Grace surveyed their situation with growing alarm. Luke was too heavy for her to carry, and the ravine was too steep for him to climb with a broken leg. The ranch was at least a mile away, and the nearest neighbor twice that distance. "I need to get help," she said decisively. Luke grabbed her wrist. "No," he said, his voice stronger. "It's too dangerous for you to ride alone across the range. Rusty knows the way home. Send him back, and one of the hands will see him and come looking." "There are no hands right now," Grace reminded him. The 2 cowhands he usually employed were away, helping a neighboring ranch with their roundup. Luke's face paled further as he realized the truth of her words. "Then you'll have to help me," he said grimly. "I can't stay here overnight." Together, they formed a plan. Grace would create a makeshift splint for his leg, then help him up the ravine where they could reach Rusty. Luke would ride, with Grace walking alongside to steady him if necessary. It was grueling work. First, Grace had to find suitable branches for the splint, then tear strips from her petticoat to secure it. Getting Luke up the steep slope was even more difficult. He tried to help as much as possible, using his good leg and arm to propel himself upward while Grace supported him, but the effort left him gray-faced and sweating. By the time they reached Rusty, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Getting Luke onto the horse was another challenge that left them both exhausted and shaking. "You've done enough," Luke said, seeing Grace's fatigue. "Ride behind me. Rusty can carry us both." Grace hesitated, but one look at Luke's ashen face convinced her. She couldn't risk him falling again. She climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist to steady him, as Rusty picked his way carefully back toward the ranch. Every step of the horse brought a grimace of pain to Luke's face, but he endured without complaint. Grace could feel him weakening against her, his body growing heavier as he fought to stay conscious. "Talk to me," she urged, fearing what would happen if he passed out. "Tell me about your first horse." Luke managed a strained chuckle. "Trying to keep me awake, Grace? Is it working?" "Yes," he admitted. "My first horse was a stubborn old pony named Mischief. He lived up to his name." Luke kept talking, the story rambling and occasionally disjointed as he battled through waves of pain, but it served the purpose of keeping him alert until they finally reached the ranch. Getting him from the horse to the house was another ordeal that left them both drenched in sweat despite the cooling evening air. Grace managed to help him to his bed, then set about properly tending his injuries. She cleaned and bandaged the head wound first, relieved to find it looked worse than it was. The broken leg was more concerning. Though she'd managed to splint it, she knew a doctor would need to set it properly. "I need to go for the doctor," she said after making Luke as comfortable as possible. "No," Luke said, catching her hand. "It's nearly dark. The trail to town is dangerous enough in daylight. But your leg can wait until morning, he insisted. I've splinted broken bones before. You did a good job. It will hold until then. Grace wanted to argue, but knew he was right. The mountain trails were treacherous at night, especially for someone unfamiliar with them. First thing tomorrow, then, she conceded. She spent the night at Luke's bedside, dozing fitfully in a chair, waking often to check on him and give him water or the laudanum she'd found in the medical supplies. By morning, his fever had risen, and the skin around his leg was hot to the touch. I'm going for the doctor now, she said firmly, brooking no argument. I've saddled Rusty and I've got the rifle. Luke tried to protest, but the fever had weakened him. Be careful, was all he managed. The ride to Central City was the most frightening thing Grace had ever done. She'd ridden horses before, but never alone across such difficult terrain. Rusty, thankfully, seemed to sense the urgency and carried her steadily, requiring minimal guidance. It had been 3 months since she'd left Central City in disgrace. As she rode down the main street, she felt the stares and heard the whispers, but she held her head high. She had more important concerns than town gossip. Dr. Miller was treating a miner with a crushed hand when she burst into his office. You need to come, she said without preamble. Luke Yates has a broken leg and a head injury. His fever is rising. The doctor looked at her in surprise, recognizing her despite the changes in her appearance. The frightened, bruised woman he'd last seen was gone, replaced by someone with purpose and determination in her eyes. Mrs. Turner, he began, I'm in the middle of— This can't wait, Grace interrupted. Please, I believe infection is setting in. Something in her manner convinced him. He quickly finished bandaging the miner's hand and gathered his supplies. I'll hitch my buggy, he said. We'll make better time than on horseback. The journey back to the ranch was tense, with Grace anxiously watching the sun's progress across the sky. Dr. Miller asked few questions during the ride, focusing instead on making good time along the rough road. They arrived to find Luke's fever higher, his skin hot and dry to the touch. The doctor examined him thoroughly, his expression growing grave. The leg is broken in 2 places, he confirmed. And yes, infection has begun. I'll need to clean the wound properly and reset the bone. It won't be pleasant. I'll help, Grace said immediately. The doctor eyed her skeptically. This isn't like tending a scraped knee, Mrs. Turner. There will be blood, and he'll be in considerable pain despite the laudanum. I understand, Grace said firmly, but he has no one else, and I won't leave him. The doctor nodded, accepting her resolve. Very well. Boil water and find all the clean linens you can. What followed was the most harrowing experience of Grace's life. Despite the laudanum, Luke screamed when the doctor manipulated the broken bones back into alignment. Grace held him down, tears streaming down her face as she murmured reassurances she wasn't sure he could hear. When it was over, Luke lay unconscious, his face white as the sheets beneath him. He's young and strong, Dr. Miller said, washing blood from his hands. With proper care, he should recover, though he may always have a slight limp. I'll care for him, Grace promised. The doctor studied her with professional interest. Your husband was quite vocal about your departure, Mrs. Turner. There's been considerable talk in town. Grace stiffened. I'm sure there has been. He claimed you abandoned him, the doctor continued, watching her reaction. But that's not what happened, is it? No, Grace said quietly. He cast me out when you confirmed I couldn't have children. He said a barren woman was worthless. The doctor had the grace to look uncomfortable. I never intended my diagnosis to cause such harm. It wasn't your fault, Grace said. The truth would have come out eventually, and Robert had already shown his true nature long before that. And now you work for Mr. Yates? I keep house for him, Grace confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. He's been a good employer and a kind friend. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, I'll return in a few days to check on his progress. In the meantime, keep the wound clean, change the bandages twice daily, and try to bring his fever down. Willow bark tea might help. After the doctor left, Grace set about making Luke as comfortable as possible. She sponged his burning skin with cool water, changed the soiled bedding, and coaxed sips of water and willow bark tea between his parched lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. For 3 days, Luke's fever raged, his moments of lucidity brief and confused. Grace barely slept, catching short naps in the chair beside his bed, afraid to leave him alone for more than a few minutes. She talked to him constantly, reading from books she found on his shelves, telling stories from her childhood, even singing the lullabies her mother had sung to her. On the 4th night, Grace was dozing beside the bed when Luke's voice, weak but clear, startled her awake. "You have a beautiful voice," he said. "I never knew." Grace sat up, immediately alert. His eyes were open and clear, the fever haze gone. She pressed a hand to his forehead and nearly wept with relief when she found it cool. "Your fever's broken," she said, her voice catching. "Thanks to you," Luke replied, his gaze steady on her face. "You saved my life, Grace." "I just did what needed doing," she said, suddenly self-conscious under his intense scrutiny. "You rode alone to Central City, faced people who had turned their backs on you, and then helped the doctor set my leg. That's more than what needed doing. That's extraordinary." Grace busied herself pouring fresh water. "You would have done the same for me." "I would," Luke agreed, "but that doesn't make what you did any less remarkable." He took the cup from her trembling hands. "You look exhausted. Have you slept at all?" "Enough," Grace said evasively. "Which means hardly at all," Luke translated with a weak smile. "Go rest, Grace. I'm not going anywhere." "I should change your bandages first," she insisted. Luke submitted to her ministrations, watching her face as she carefully unwrapped the dressings and cleaned the healing wound. Her touch was gentle yet sure, her concentration complete as she worked. "The infection is definitely improving," she reported, rewrapping his leg with fresh bandages. "But you'll need to stay off it for several weeks." "I can't do that," Luke protested. "The ranch will still be here when you're healed," Grace said firmly, using his own words from her first night on the ranch. "I've been managing the essential chores, and Dr. Miller said he would send word to your hands to return early." Luke looked at her with new respect. "You've thought of everything." "I've had plenty of time to think while watching you toss with fever," Grace said, attempting lightness despite her exhaustion. "Grace," Luke said softly. "Thank you." The simple words contained such warmth that Grace felt herself blushing. "You should rest now," she said, gathering the used bandages. "I'll bring you something to eat soon." Over the following weeks, Luke's recovery progressed steadily. The head wound healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that would eventually be hidden by his hair. The leg was slower to mend, but by the time Dr. Miller removed the splint, it was clear that he would indeed walk again, though with a slight limp as predicted. During his convalescence, the dynamic between Luke and Grace subtly shifted. Physical necessity had broken down some of the careful boundaries they'd maintained. Grace had tended him at his most vulnerable, seen him in states of undress that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances. Luke, for his part, had revealed more of himself in his fever dreams than he might have chosen, calling for Grace in his delirium, sometimes with words that made her blush. Neither of them spoke of these intimate moments, but they hung in the air between them, creating a new awareness that was increasingly difficult to ignore. Luke's hands returned and took over the outdoor work, leaving Grace free to focus on nursing Luke back to health. She read to him during the long afternoons, played checkers and cards to keep his mind occupied, and gradually helped him regain his strength through gentle exercises. One evening in early September, with Luke finally able to walk short distances using a crutch, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The air held the first hint of autumn crispness, a welcome relief after the summer heat. "I received a letter from Mrs. Wilkins today," Luke said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Her daughter had a healthy baby boy, and they're doing well. She says she misses the ranch but has decided to stay in Denver permanently to be near her grandchild." "I'm glad they're doing well," Grace said sincerely. "She also said she won't be returning," Luke continued, watching Grace's profile. "Which means her position here is permanently open, if you want it." Grace turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You want me to stay on permanently?" "If you wish to," Luke said carefully. "You've made this place more of a home than it's ever been. I can pay you more now that the cattle sale went through. You'd have security, independence." "That's very generous," Grace said, her heart sinking a little at his businesslike tone. What had she expected? A declaration of love? She chided herself for such foolish thoughts. "But if you prefer to move on, I understand," Luke added quickly. "You might want a fresh start somewhere new, away from Central City and unpleasant memories." "Is that what you want?" Grace asked, unable to keep a hint of hurt from her voice. "For me to leave?" "No," Luke said forcefully, then more gently. "No, Grace. That's the last thing I want." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "What do you want?" "Luke." Luke took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper, but as—" He faltered, then tried again. "These past months, despite everything, have been the happiest of my life, because of you. Because of your strength, your kindness, your courage." Grace's heart began to pound as she realized where his words were leading. "I've fallen in love with you, Grace," Luke said simply. "I think I started falling the moment I saw you by that creek, so wounded yet still fighting. I've tried to keep my feelings to myself because I know you've been hurt, and the last thing I wanted was to add to that burden. But when I was lying there with fever, thinking I might die, my only regret was that I hadn't told you the truth." Grace sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by his confession. Luke misinterpreted her silence and began to withdraw. "I understand if you don't feel the same," he said quickly, "or if you're not ready. I won't mention it again, and nothing needs to change. You can stay as my housekeeper for as long as you wish, with no expectations." "Luke," Grace said, finally finding her voice, "do you remember what you said to me that first day? When I told you about Robert casting me out for being barren?" Luke looked confused by the apparent change of subject. "I said a lot of things." "You said I was worth more than bearing babies," Grace reminded him. "No one had ever said anything like that to me before. No one had ever valued me for myself, not for what I could provide." She reached out and took his hand. "I've been afraid to admit my feelings, afraid to trust my own judgment after being so wrong about Robert. But I'm not afraid anymore." Luke's eyes widened with hope. "What are you saying, Grace?" "I'm saying that I love you too," she said, the words bringing a sense of rightness, of coming home. "I love your kindness, your integrity, your strength. I love the way you see me, the real me, not just what I can do for you." Luke brought her hand to his lips, kissing it reverently. "I never want you to doubt your worth again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single moment." "I believe you," Grace said softly. "But Luke, you should know that I can never give you children. If that's something you want." "Grace," Luke interrupted gently, "I want you. Children would be a blessing, yes, but they're not a requirement for happiness. There are many ways to build a family. We could adopt a child who needs a home, if that's something you would want someday, or we could be content with just the two of us. What matters to me is that we face whatever comes together as equals." Tears filled Grace's eyes at his words, at the future he was offering her, one based on love and respect rather than obligation and expectations. "I would like that very much." Luke leaned forward, hesitating just before his lips met hers. "May I kiss you, Grace?" In answer, Grace closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that held all the tenderness and promise of new beginnings. When they finally drew apart, Luke rested his forehead against hers, his eyes shining with happiness. "Marry me, Grace," he whispered. "Not because you need security or because I need a housekeeper, but because we're better together than apart." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Luke Yates." Their wedding took place a month later in the small church in Central City, with the ranch hands as witnesses and a few of Luke's friends in attendance. Grace wore a simple ivory dress she'd made herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Luke stood straight and proud beside her, his limp barely noticeable as they spoke their vows. Robert Turner was among the curious onlookers who gathered outside the church, his face darkening with anger when he saw his former wife emerge radiant on the arm of her new husband. Grace met his gaze steadily, without fear, before turning away to accept the good wishes of Luke's friends. That evening, as they sat on the porch of what was now their home, Luke presented Grace with a gift, a small wooden sign he'd carved himself that read, "Flying YT Ranch." "I thought we should make it official," he explained. "This place is as much yours as mine now." Grace traced the letters with her finger, touched by the gesture. "It's perfect." "There's something else," Luke said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. "This came while you were getting ready for the wedding. I didn't want to distract you then." Grace opened the envelope to find a letter from an attorney in St. Louis. As she read, her eyes widened in surprise. "My Aunt Eliza died," she said, looking up at Luke. "I barely knew her. She was my mother's older sister. We exchanged letters occasionally, but I hadn't heard from her in years." She shook her head in disbelief. "She's left me her house and a small sum of money." "Grace, that's wonderful," Luke said. "Do you want to go to St. Louis? We could use the money to expand the ranch when we return." Grace considered the offer, thinking of the possibilities the inheritance represented. "Actually, I have another idea. Dr. Miller mentioned that the town needs a proper orphanage. There are too many children left without parents after mining accidents and disease." Luke nodded, understanding immediately where her thoughts were leading. "You want to use the money to help establish an orphanage?" "Yes," Grace said, growing more excited as she developed the idea. "We could donate the money, perhaps serve on the board, and maybe in time we might find a child there who needs a home, a family." Luke pulled her into his arms, his heart full of love for this remarkable woman. "I think that's a perfect plan," he said, "and a perfect way to honor your aunt's memory." "Do you really think so?" Grace asked. "I know so," Luke assured her. "You have so much love to give, Grace. Those children would be blessed to have you in their lives, as I am blessed to have you in mine." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, talking of their future together, the plans for the ranch, the orphanage, the life they would build. For Grace, who had once believed her worth was measured only by her ability to bear children, it was the fulfillment of a dream she hadn't dared to hope for, to be loved completely for exactly who she was. 5 years later, the Flying YT Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the area. The main house had been expanded to accommodate the family that now lived there, Luke and Grace, along with their adopted children, 10-year-old Thomas, who had lost his parents in a mining accident, and 6-year-old twins, Sarah and Samuel, whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father had been unable to care for them. The Central City Children's Home, founded with Grace's inheritance and supported by ongoing contributions from the ranch's profits, provided a safe haven for orphaned and abandoned children. Grace served as its board president, visiting weekly to read to the children and ensure they received the care and attention they deserved. On a golden autumn afternoon, similar to the one when Luke had first declared his love, the family gathered in the meadow behind the house for a picnic to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. Thomas was teaching the twins to fly a kite, their laughter carrying on the breeze as Luke and Grace watched from their blanket under an old oak tree. "Are you happy, Grace?" Luke asked, his arm around her shoulders. Grace looked at their children playing, at the home they had built together, at the man beside her who had shown her what true love meant. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "You gave me a future when I thought mine was over. You gave me a family when I believed I would never have one." "We gave each other those things," Luke corrected gently. "That's what partners do." Grace rested her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had once believed was beyond her reach. The wounds of her past had healed, leaving scars that had made her stronger rather than bitter. She had found purpose beyond the narrow roles society had prescribed for her, and love that valued her for exactly who she was. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes I think about that day by the creek, when you found me at my lowest moment. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't spoken those words to me." "But I did," Luke said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "and you were brave enough to take a chance on a stranger." "The best chance I ever took," Grace agreed. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Grace looked at the family she and Luke had created, not through the bonds of blood, but through the stronger ties of love, choice, and commitment. It was a family born of compassion, nurtured by respect, and strengthened by shared purpose. In the distance, Thomas had succeeded in getting the kite aloft, the bright fabric soaring against the blue sky as the twins cheered. Luke squeezed Grace's hand, his eyes reflecting the same joy that filled her heart. "Worth more than bearing babies," he murmured, echoing those first words that had given her hope. "Worth everything."